Hi everyone, Cathy Balding here again, and it's great to be with you to talk about part 3 of our ISQA QI fundamentals, managing change. But first I want to give you a little bit of context for change in health, because making changes in a health service is really making changes in a complex system. And this is challenging because of the unique characteristics of complex systems. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the whys and wherefores of change, what makes change work in complex systems, and then we're going to use the 9 complex change basic steps to work through how you then address change in this environment. In health, we often use mechanistic approaches to change. And there's nothing wrong with that, of course. These steps are important. We define the operational need for change. We then work out a project for how we're going to achieve that change. We design and plan that project. We often develop new policies and systems to support that change, and then we implement, and sometimes we even evaluate. And there's nothing wrong with those things in and of themselves, but in a complex system, that's only half the story. Because in a factory, that sort of mechanistic, process-driven change works very well. But unfortunately, your health service is less like a factory and more like a village, where there are many people doing many different things, living together, working together day after day, and there are many factors at work that are going to get in the way of your change. So yes, you have to get the process right, but you also have to get the people side of change right. And I know that many of you will have experienced approaching a group of staff who will be affected by a change with a beautiful plan and even a great reason for making a change, and you'll have experienced lots of resistance or perhaps half-heartedness, or even a change that was implemented well to start with and then faded away. And when you went back to see them a month later, things were back to the old way. And often that is because we haven't paid enough attention to the people side of change. And there's some really interesting work that's been done around the people side of change, particularly the way people follow rules in complex systems. We often set and forget in health. We say, yes, we'll change that policy and then people will follow it and therefore the change will happen. But life isn't really like that. Interestingly, for the things that people think are really important, there will be about 60% compliance. That's amazing, isn't it, when you think about it, that the things that people think are really important, they will still only comply with about 60% of the time. For things that people think are not important, there will only be 10% compliance. And key influences for compliance or non-compliance with a rule or a process or a policy are leadership, peer pressure and peer support, and a belief that the rule is worth following and relevant to helping them do their job. So these are very important things to think about and to take into consideration when we're planning our change in complex systems. And even if they are followed, beautiful policies and rules and processes, all the lovely changes you might have made, they won't be followed necessarily forever, because there are so many forces at work in complex systems, so many competing priorities, different people with different agendas, different outcomes and different goals. Your beautiful policy or rule or change may in fact erode over time and can become unrecognisable over time as people change it, shave a little bit off here, knock a step off there. It can get to the point where your beautifully crafted change becomes something that isn't very effective anymore. And this is life in complex systems. It's not because people are bad, it's because it's the way of the world in a busy, challenging, complex environment. I often see a an approach to quality that I call PACEM. That's my acronym, and that's P for policy and procedure, A for awareness, C for communication, E for education, and M for meetings. And PACEM is probably the most commonly used change model that I see in healthcare. And there's nothing wrong with those things. In and of themselves, they're very important parts of change. But you can see what's missing, can't you? That people side of change just isn't there. It's very mechanistic, but it is something that we see a lot of. So hang on to those things if you're doing them. That's perfectly fine. But let's add some of the good people stuff as well. The people side of change has two key components. We have the human response to change, which everyone experiences when faced with change. You do, I do, everybody does. And then there's the complex systems side of how people work with change in the challenging health service environment. So if you're introducing a change, you will see, first of all, the status quo, everyone going about their business. And when they hear about the change, they will generally move into some sort of shock. And their happiness with the old way and the habits of their day-to-day work that they like and they've been working with possibly for a very long time evaporate. And suddenly it's about, no one can do that to me, this is the way we do things here, I won't be able to do that, it's too different, they can't change my system. Then people often move into anger, and this is where people can get very stuck, and that's about the how dare they. I can't get it right, I'm trying, this doesn't make any sense, it's a disaster. If you can't help people through the human response to change, they can get very stuck in that, and that's where you get all of your resistance. Now, people don't move through this in a linear way, unfortunately. They go forwards and backwards, and as I said, they can get very stuck. So the trick for you is to move them from anger to possibility. And if you can do that, get them to the point where they can say, ah yes, I can see that things might be better, and they're listening to me. I'm making suggestions about how this change can be improved, and they're being taken on board. You really can help people move through that resistance. And then hopefully the new way becomes the old way. And a lot of this is about the beliefs and assumptions of the people involved, and we'll talk about those a little bit more in a minute. But behaviour is driven by people's beliefs, and behaviour is what drives change. So it's fantastic to have all the other change components. You've got to have your goals and your objectives, your governance supports, your leaders, your systems, your strategy, all the things we'll talk about in a minute. But you must also have the beliefs and the assumptions directed at the change that you want to make, because those are the things that ultimately drive behaviour in human beings, and it's behaviour that will make your changes. We're going to cover 9 complex change basics, and I'll just read through them quickly and then we'll explore them in a bit more detail. First, create the need for change and explain the reason for change. Second, gather your pre-planning intelligence and create a mud map of the current situation. Step 3, develop a vision for change and the goals and objectives with those who are expected to implement the change. 4, get the governance of your project right. Identify who is who and who needs to do what really, really clearly, because that is a critical step, often missed. Step 5, develop a change plan based on the current processes in place and the current beliefs in place. Include both people and process change strategies. Step 6, use robust project management strategies to drive and monitor the change and to report on and feedback information about progress with the change. Step 7, enable people closest to the change to have some control over how the change is rolled out. And we'll discuss the DKRS framework for doing just that. 8, test with short cycle pilots. Watch out for fallout, recalibrate and redirect as required. And 9, embed in systems, roles and the physical environment. So now let's take a look at how the 9 complex change basics can help us navigate the challenges of change in healthcare. So step 1 is create the need for and explain the reason for the change, and no doubt you already know this. People need a good reason to change. So it's either it's going to make life better for them, better for their patients, their clients, their residents, their consumers, or it's going to save them time, which is a great driver in healthcare as everyone is so busy. If you possibly can, find the good reason for the change and the advantage in the change. And you won't always be able to do this, of course. Sometimes in health, changes are imposed and you are the messenger. You're the person who has to make those changes happen. The important thing there is to be honest with people. Work with them. Talk to them about the fact that you don't have any say, really, in the change that's made. This is something that perhaps has come from an external source, a funding source, a governance source. But let's work together to try and make this as positive as we possibly can. Let's find the advantages in this, even if they aren't apparent immediately. So very important that you work with people right up front to say, how can we make the best of a change that we either want to make or have to make? And give them time then to discuss and to digest that change before you go back to gather your pre-planning intelligence. So steps 2 and 3 I'm going to address together because that really is in real life how you would address them. So we've got step 2, gather your pre-planning intelligence, and step 3, develop a vision and goals for the change. So as we said earlier, behaviours create change, and a critical step to behaviour change is belief change. And one of the best tools for belief change that you can use and that you must have in your change toolbox is empathy. Empathy is about starting where they are, not where you are. And this can be very difficult for enthusiastic change managers or quality managers who have this great idea, who can see the benefits, who want to share it with people and make it happen. Remember that mentally you've gone far beyond where the people are who have to actually implement the change. You've already digested it, worked out the advantages, seen the possibilities. You're miles ahead of them. You've got to go back and start where they are. And that means discussing, observing, attending meetings, informal and formal ways of finding out how things are done now and why they're done the way that they are. So it might be for them, what do they perceive as the advantages and disadvantages of making the change? How will the change affect their day-to-day business? What current processes that seem to be working quite well from their perspective would need to be done differently, and how difficult would that be? What beliefs are anchoring the way things are currently done? And that's an interesting one to try and tease out. What do people believe about the way things are currently done that are good? Because those beliefs are very strong and they will anchor things in the old way whilst you're trying to introduce a new way. So finding out what those beliefs are is very important. And then, given all of that, what is the burning platform? What's a good reason to change? What can you do for them as part of this change? How can you make life better for their patients? What's the vision that's going to motivate them to change the way they do things? What are the goals that are going to be clear enough and exciting enough for them to make them want to put the work and effort in that it takes to change anything in a complex system? And of course, we need great goals. If you aim at nothing, that's exactly what you'll hit. And some of you who've watched part 2 will know that I discussed this at some length in part 2 of the QI fundamentals when we talk about planning for quality, planning for great care. And it's so important that you develop SMART goals, so specific, measurable, applicable, realistic, time-bound, things that are absolutely crystal clear so that people know what it is that they're trying to achieve. They know what the team is together trying to do. And this is really for you about investing in the front end of change. It might seem like a lot of effort, but I know, and I'm sure that you know, that without investing in this period of the change process, you can spend a lot of time at the back end fixing, reworking, rescuing the change that you thought was going to be implemented smoothly and beautifully, only to find that it wasn't. Step 4 is getting the governance of your project right. Now, people often do this first, and that's fine as long as you do it at some stage. It probably doesn't matter exactly where in the process this comes. Some people don't do it at all. I find that it's better to do it after you've created the mud map of the current situation. You've conducted your pre-planning intelligence, you've done some planning with the people who will have to implement the change, because it becomes much clearer then who needs to be involved, both formally and informally. And this is about clarifying roles, making sure that everyone involved has their own role and responsibility for the change. It might be as senior and as formal as project manager reporting to the executive. It might be as informal as someone at the front end of the change spreading the word at each meeting about how things are going. Each role in change is really important, but people have to be very clear about what their role is and what their deliverable is. And the formal side of this, of course, is which committee does this change report to? Which strategic aim of your organisation does it link with? Because the more you can link your changes and your initiatives with where the organisation is going, particularly if there are things that are, say, mandatory or policy driven that your organisation has to comply with, if your change can help the organisation achieve these things, you're going to get a lot more support. You're going to get a lot more formal governance around your change too. And hopefully that means senior support and help for what you're trying to achieve. Who has carriage of the project? You might think this is a very obvious question, but I've seen many changes where there are too many people who think they own the change and not enough people actually implementing the change. So you do need really good, clear project and change management, but you need people at the front line saying, what are the different behaviours that we must engage in? What are the things that we do have to redesign or do differently on Monday than we did on Friday? Who is responsible for making those individual things happen? Because all of those things come together in the end to create your change. Step 5 is to then really get down into the planning, the change. Now, plans don't have to be long and complicated. They can be quite simple and quite straightforward. But what I've found is that the important thing when planning change, particularly with clinical staff, is to do it in their language. We often use management language when we're talking about change, and this can really lose people. You can have done all the right things. Start where they are, create your mud map, get your governance right, have some great goals and vision that engages people, and you can lose them at the planning because you're using management jargon. And this makes life very difficult for busy clinicians who really just want to get on. So I found that you can discuss the change process with them in their own language. Because when you think about it, the change process is, in fact, the diagnostic and treatment cycle. Different words, definitely applied in a different way. But when you look at them, they're very similar. And so you can talk to your clinicians, talk to your doctors about the fact that we start with assessment. Where are we at now? What will it take to move from where we are to where we want to be? We do a diagnosis. Is it about this situation that needs improvement? What are the problems with this situation? How can we make it better? You then create your plan. How will we get from where we are now to where we want to go? What are our goals for this process? What are we trying to achieve? And of course, the clearer that is, as we said before, the easier it is to pursue them. Ambiguity in goals does not work very well because it's hard to know when you've hit the target, and it's very difficult to keep people motivated when people aren't quite sure exactly where it is they're going. Then you move into treatment. This is when you implement the change. What are the things we actually have to do and who has to do what to make this happen? Then you monitor. of course. You're always monitoring when you're treating patients. Is the treatment working? Is it the right treatment? Do we need to adjust the dose or the frequency or the type? That is part of what clinicians do, and that's exactly what we do with change. We monitor. Are we doing the right things to get the results that we want? If not, that's not failure. That just means we have to recalibrate. We have to redirect. So this is part of the cycle that clinicians are used to. And then we evaluate, did it work? Did we achieve the goals we wanted to? And if so, we sustain that and we work out how we're going to sustain it. So I found that using the diagnosis and treatment cycle with clinicians when talking about a change we're going to make helps them to understand the process that we have to work through. And it isn't just saying that on Monday we'll do X, whereas we currently do Y. They understand it's a process, that it's important to understand where you're starting from, that it's important to monitor, and it's important to adjust your treatment if things aren't working. So try it and see how it goes. But speaking to people in their language, I found, is always better than speaking to them in yours, particularly if you're using management language. Now, very importantly, behind all of this, you should have a robust change model, and that can be as complex as you like. But the people at the front line engaged in implementing the change, they don't need to see that. That's your way of monitoring and driving your own process and making sure that it's robust. But the people at the front line just need to know exactly where they are in that diagnosis and treatment change cycle, so it keeps them engaged and moving along. Based on this behaviour that we want to change and using that diagnosis and treatment cycle, once you've got your plan in place, make sure that you've inserted or amalgamated some of the motivators for change that we know work with people in healthcare. So they're things like how people perceive they are measured and rewarded. You know, can you work those sorts of things into your plan so that if people currently are rewarded for how they're doing things now, how can we reward them for doing things differently? What the boss appears to think is important. Very important motivator in all industries, but particularly so in healthcare. The boss has to be walking the walk and talking the talk. The boss needs to be engaged in the change, committed to it, not just talking about it, but out there helping to make it happen, and people need to see that. And if they see that, they will start to believe that this is an important thing that they should be involved with. Similarly, what their peers think is important. Trying to get a bit of a critical mass and a bit of groundswell around your change is very helpful so that people can see that others, hopefully those particularly they respect and want to be a part of, are also engaged in the change. Opportunities to make things better for patients and staff. Spell it out. Spell out the advantages as clearly as you possibly can. Opportunities to learn and develop. People in healthcare really do like to develop and improve their skills and knowledge. Really, they have to keep up with their job because of the way in which healthcare knowledge is increasing and the velocity of that. People have to keep up, so if it helps them to do that, if it helps them get points for their college or professional development points or credits towards their study that they might be undertaking, or helps them to perhaps write an article or a conference paper, all of those things are very helpful to people in healthcare. Ways to make work easier and more efficient. Everyone wants to work more quickly and more easily, and that is just life, because generally speaking, life in healthcare is quite tough. There's a lot to do and not enough time to do it in, and so what people are looking for is shortcuts, and that's not a bad thing. That's being human. So if you can help them with that, that's definitely a motivator. And finally, the beliefs and assumptions that we've talked about. If you can show them with an experience or a concrete example that this change will make something better, then they're going to believe it. You can tell them till the cows come home that something's going to make life better for them. You need to show them. So get some early wins, get some early concrete examples, and you'll be well on the way to motivating your staff to be involved in the change. Step 6, we're talking about robust project management. And I don't want to say too much about this because there are many fine models of project management around. My recommendation is that you find one that works for you and use it. And as I said before, that's for your back of house use. You don't have to train everyone involved in the change in project management theory and practice. If they'd like to be, that's fantastic. By all means, cultivate them. But this is for you. This is a project management model that helps keep you on track, helps keep you organised and clear about where you are at any given time in the change, helps you monitor your progress and report on your progress. And an important thing about progress, just while we're on that, is about keeping people at the front line absolutely as up to date as possible with where things are at. And don't be afraid to use raw data for that. You might need to use something more sophisticated in terms of trends when you're reporting up to your executive or your committee, but people at the front line love raw data. If you're doing a project, for example, on changing the way that pressure ulcers are managed, for example, and you can say to people, 3 fewer people last week developed pressure ulcers than the week before. That may not be statistically significant, but to the people at the front line, that means a lot. So once again, when you're managing your project and you're communicating and reporting about your project, use the language of the people that you're working with. Step 7 is give those at the front line of the change as much control as possible over how the change is made. Now, why would I say this? You may think that this is just a given, that people at the front line who are implementing the change will always have control over the change. But when you think about it, we often tell people how to implement the change, and to a certain extent, you may have to do that. There are certain things that may have to be the way that you need them to be done. Because of a policy imperative or an external imperative or an accreditation imperative. There are many reasons why something has to be done a certain way. But as far as possible, give every bit of leeway you can to the frontline people to work out locally how their aspect of the change can be managed. Because that breeds ownership. And once you've got ownership of the change, you're more than halfway there. You can take your hands off the wheel to a certain extent. You don't have to drive people so hard. You don't feel like you're pushing people uphill as hard because they will be driving themselves. And that's really, as a change agent, where you want to go. And a model for cultivating ownership with people is what I call the DKRS model. And that's direction, knowledge, resources, and support. And these are all of the things that are required for people to take ownership of a change and run with it. So the D is direction, and that's some of the things we've talked about, all brought in under the one model. So we've got the why, a good reason for doing it. We've got clear leadership and goals. People know how the change is going to be measured. They understand their role in the change and their boundaries. They understand the decisions that they can make around the change and those that they can't. So they understand when they can alter the change or tailor the change or make suggestions about the change, and when they can't. So they know what's flexible and what's not. The second is knowledge, and so that's about making sure that people have the information to carry out the change, and that may be information they've never had before. They may need to know about decisions that certain high-level committees are making that they've never known about before, but that are incredibly important for them to be able to carry out the change. They need the skills to carry out the change. And certainly in my experience, clinicians will not always admit when they don't feel confident doing something because they're used to being expert. And so don't assume that they'll have the skills perhaps to collect a set of data for you or to review the way something is done. They're easy things to say, but not everyone knows how to do that. They might be highly skilled clinicians, but never having really done anything like this before. So if you ask people to do something, make sure they have the skills and knowledge to do it. They also need interpersonal skills. If they're going to suddenly be chairing a meeting, for example, a project meeting, don't assume everyone knows how to do that. Make sure they've got the knowledge and skills to do that. So equip people for the change, essentially. Resources we know are important and not always available. When people say, I need more resources, drill down. Find out exactly what it is they need. Sometimes You think it's going to be a great big insurmountable problem, and what it comes down to is I need access to the computer at 4 o'clock when that report comes through. So there are some things with resources that you can help with, and there will be some probably that you can't, but find out the things that you can help with. It might be tools for data collection. It might be facilities such as computer access. It might be time, and where you can, if you're asking people to do something differently, see if you can take something from them while they're making the change. I know that's not always possible in the healthcare environment, but we often just keep giving people things to do without necessarily taking anything back. And funding, of course. If you can get funding for the change to give people some time to implement for backfill, for example, that's a precious gift. If you can manage that, that's great. We know it's not always possible. And finally, support. And this is something in health perhaps we're not as good at as we should be. People need input. They need coaching, feedback, encouragement, reinforcement, recognition for the part they're playing in the change. And the secret of DKRS is that you have to have all four. If you want people to own a change, it has to be D, K, R and S. What I often see is perhaps some good direction, not very good knowledge. Fantastic support, not very good direction, or not the resources to actually carry out the change. So very important that you supply all four. It seems like more of the front end effort, but it will really repay you in you not having to drive the change when people pick it up and run with it. Step 8 is test with short cycle pilots, and once again I'm not going to talk too much about this because we did talk about PDSA in the first QI fundamentals. I won't go over old ground. Everything about short cycle PDSA pilots is there, but just to reinforce that these work very well in complex systems. It's not about setting a change in motion and going back 3 months later to find out what's happening. Short cycle pilots, depending on the type of change of course, but it might be weekly that you put something in train and then go back to the people who are implementing it and assess, get their feedback. It can be very informal. Or you might have formal measures that you've been collecting that are very useful. But it's important in a complex system to put these short cycle pilots into action when you're implementing your plan, because they will pick up a lot of the unintended consequences that come with any change in a complex system. Because there are so many factors at work in healthcare, you can't help but have some unintended consequences when you change something. And so the short cycle pilots are a good way of finding out exactly where those unintended consequences are popping up. And it's a great way to engage people in the change by allowing them to problem solve. Moving people through that human response to change, getting them out of that anger that they can so easily get stuck in, requires them to feel that they're useful in the change, and allowing them to problem solve and make suggestions about how the change could be improved is a great way to do that. And so if you're doing your short cycle pilots and you're getting some unintended consequences, or the change isn't achieving what it's supposed to, it's a method for allowing people at the front line to tell you how they think perhaps the next stage of the change should be put into train so that you can avoid some of those problems. So step 9 is embed and sustain the change. And there are some very active things that need to be done. A lot of people think that once the change has been made, there's nothing else to do. But a proactive approach to embedding and sustaining the change will make sure that your change doesn't fade too much over time. And this is very similar to the diagnostic and treatment cycle, where when we get a desired result with a consumer, we then work out with them the best way for them to sustain that once they've left your care. So it's exactly the same principle and process. So you can remove the old way. So particularly if it's something like a form change or an equipment change, make sure the old way is removed, because habit is a strong motivator and people will revert to the old way if it's there. Develop forcing functions if that's possible. So that's things like mandatory fields on computers where people can't not do it the way that it needs to be done. because you can't progress, say, in a process until you've filled in that field. So if possible, develop forcing functions, because it makes it easier for people to comply with, because they don't really have to think, they just do it. Include it in job descriptions if that's possible. That's not always relevant, but if it is, it can be a very strong way of reinforcing the new way. And of course, policy and procedure, as we've said, in and of themselves, they're not strong drivers of change, but as part of a change package, they're incredibly important. Included in things like orientation and education sessions. All of these are very important jigsaw puzzle pieces that all need to come together to create the change puzzle. Keep it on a committee agenda, depending on the magnitude of the change. That might be a short time or a long time, but keeping it on an agenda makes it easy to track where things are at, keeps it front and centre of people's minds until you really are satisfied that the new way has been embedded. And appoint a keeper of the change. That might be a formal manager, or it might be an informal person who is interested in the change, has had perhaps a lot to do with it, and preferably someone who talks a lot to a lot of people. What we need is someone who'll get around and keep that change in people's minds. And so there's always someone like that in any health service, any department, and if you can get them on side, they're great promoters of the change, and they really do help to embed and sustain the change. So just to finish off, let's try to pull all this together. We have some process steps for change and we have some people steps, and they do come together quite nicely. So if we use the clinical model as our change model, we might start with assessment. Where are we now? And that's start where they are. Look at the beliefs, look at how things are done now, work out who does what and what keeps the current situation working as it does. What are the anchors? Then we move into diagnosis and planning as a process step, and the people step there is explain the need for the change, the advantages of the change, find some advantages if they're not immediately apparent, work with the people who will implement the change to see what the benefits could be, set clear goals and strategies and first steps. Then we move into the treatment step, and then we're using DKRS. That's where we're trying to get people to really own the change and understand their role in it. And we're equipping them by giving them direction, knowledge, resources and support to undertake the change competently and successfully. Then in the process step, we monitor to see how things are, and that's where you're going to involve people in short cycle pilots, make sure staff have a say in problem solving and how things can be done better if things aren't working out the way that you'd planned. And then evaluate and sustain, and that's where you're embedding the change into the way things really happen. The job descriptions, the processes and procedures and policies, the education, all of the things that I described earlier in PACEM. But because you've also managed the people side of things, PACEM then takes its place as a very important part of the overall change process. So to finish, I think my final tip would be find a great change model that works for you. There are many great change models out there. You don't need to develop one yourself. But when you do, make sure that it contains the sorts of things we've been talking about today. Make sure it's not just a process change model, but also integrates the very important people change steps that we've talked about. Invest in the front end of change so that you don't spend half your life reworking and rescuing change that's not working because it's been poorly implemented and because the people side of change hasn't been well enough considered. I hope this serves you well. I hope it really helps you with your change and quality efforts. And it's been a great pleasure to present part 3 of QI Fundamentals on Managing Change. Thank you.